Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, and for Bev in Australia, good morning, and welcome to today's Coaching in Context webinar. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this session. My name is Dr. Okokon Udo. I am the Director of the Evidence-Based Coaching Program, and this monthly forum is hosted by the Evidence-Based Coaching. A few things before we get started. We will invite you to please stay muted until the speaker invites you to make contributions during the course of this hour. The second thing is, if you need the CCEU, you are entitled to 1.0 CCEU through the ICF. And the way to do that is to take note of the link I will be sharing close to the end of this presentation. Once you complete that survey, we will process it to the registrar's office at Fielding, and you will receive your certificate within 4 days. So it's important that you complete the survey to receive that. I will also be posting a few links for the next Coaching in Context webinar. And so with that said, I will introduce our speaker for today, and then we will move into our presentation. So we have with us Bev Paulin. She is a registered psychologist in Australia. She's also a professional certified coach through the ICF. She's an educator. She has enjoyed a diverse career in Australia and in Asia, including senior leadership roles in the corporate, global consulting, and education sectors across the areas of organizational capability, leadership development, career management, and leadership coaching. Over a 10-year period, she led and expanded coach communities of practice across countries in the Asia-Pacific region and worked closely with coaches from diverse cultures and linguistic contexts. Her passion and advocacy for the adoption of diverse perspectives in human-centered practices was sparked by the relocation to Asia and ultimately 14 years working across that region. The experience of deep cultural immersion was a profound and humbling engine for growth and a catalyst for a deep and ongoing curiosity about the generative developmental impact of encountering human diversity. It is the inspiration behind her doctoral research and commitment to diversity, inclusion, and belonging in coaching research and practice. I was actually honored, very honored, to serve as one of her readers, and her defense was, I would say, incredible. I cannot wait to lay my hands on that book there, really. And I think if you publish that, it's one that anyone interested in the field of coaching and development and diversity, equity, and inclusion should be able to access. So there's a lot more I can say about Bev in terms of her degrees and credentials, but I want to limit it now and just say how pleased I am to welcome you to our platform today, Bev. And with that said, I will turn it over to you. So please join me in welcoming Bev, Paulin.
Thank you very much, Okokon, and welcome everyone. I am delighted to be here today to have a conversation and discussion with you around the area of diversity and inclusion in coaching. And I would say, you know, I am a very proud graduate of the Fielding certificate, EBC certificate. I found that a sensational program, so I'm delighted to be back here today. So let me just move to share my screen. But just before I do that, I'll just point out that what you will notice throughout the session today is that I will be inviting comments, feedback, conversation from you. So It's not a session where I'll be presenting a lot of information and then we move to questions. I have really planned this as a session in which we can have some dialogue together around what we are noticing in our own practices, around coaching practices around diversity, and how that might be actually impacting us as coaches and our practice. So let me just move to share my screen. Okay. Okay, so before I begin, I would just like to acknowledge the Kaurna Nation and its people as the traditional owners on the land on which I am meeting you today, and pay my respects to elders past and present. As Okokon mentioned, I am dialing in from Australia, and I am in South Australia. So a few quick key questions which are sort of guiding our conversation and session today are these. And these are the sorts of questions that I think that we could be talking about together. And I'd be really interested to hear about your experiences. The first one is really, what are the contextual spaces that are present in coaching? If we were to really start to identify and name those spaces, what are we noticing about those spaces? How would we identify them? In what ways are we meeting diversity in our coaching practice? I have spent over the past sort of couple of decades, a lot of conversations with coaches thinking about the aspect of diversity and inclusion and how that actually impacts on our practice. That's a question that I think is an important one for us to consider. And more broadly, what are our experiences? What can we share together about our experiences that will be helpful for all of us? So just to begin, it would be great to hear from any of you about what has actually brought you here today. What has brought you to this session? If anyone would like to come off mute and share something about what has brought you to this session today, I would love to hear about that. You can just come off mute, or you can and share what's brought you here today. Was there something particularly of interest, or what captured your attention?
Yeah.
Anyone like to share?
There is one comment in chat by Carl, interested in the topic of diversity in coaching.
Great. Thanks, Carl. And thanks for dropping it into the chat. That's another way, if you don't want to come off mute, but you want to put anything into the chat, that would be wonderful as well.
This is Peggy. What brought me here today is I have been doing a lot more coaching with people from outside of Canada. So from a variety of different cultures, different backgrounds, and sometimes I feel there's a little hesitancy from them as to whether or not they should trust me. So it's about building that relationship, I guess, in the context of diversity.
Okay, thanks for sharing that, Peggy.
Mm-hmm. And Sherry says she likes to stay in touch with her coaching university, and speakers are interesting.
Great. Thanks, Sherry. Any other comments before we move forward?
Catherine says, always looking to deepen my awareness, to deepen my engagement and connection with the individual and group coaching participants, diverse backgrounds, working to create equity in group experiences from the coaching perspective.
Great. Yeah. Also, you know, really sort of focused on the, if you like, the flavor in our conversation today. It'd be really interesting to hear about your experiences, and we will also be making use of breakout rooms as well, so that you can get into conversation with each other.
The last one from Masha just says curiosity.
Okay. Great. It's a curious topic, that's for sure. Okay, for some reason, here we go. So if I was just to begin, you know, in the introduction, Okakon pointed to some of the experience that I had in Asia and across the Asia Pacific region. And, you know, that was really the catalyst for me, really taking a deeper look at the whole area of diversity, inclusion, and belonging in coaching. And it's something that I have been working with for over 2 decades in my own practice. And it was also the impetus behind my doctoral research. But if I was to just reflect on the journey as a piece of background, one of the ways I find it helpful to think about it is to think about what was happening in the outer world and what was happening in the inner world. So in the outer world, you know, I made this relocation. I moved to Asia. Singapore in particular was my first location that I lived and worked in, and began this cultural immersion in a different culture to what I grew up in. Before I went to Singapore, I thought it would be a great learning opportunity, but I realized fairly quickly that I really underestimated just how important the experience was going to be, and how deep the learning would become. So I had this very deep cultural immersion experience and began to think about, actually, you know, how is this reflected in coaching theory or theories that are relevant for coaching, and also in coaching practice. So I started to look into those sort of fields for in terms of aiming to draw some guidance for myself, being in this very different cultural environment. In the inner world, I really started to ask myself some questions about what prepares me to do this work. So to work with clients and coaches who were coming from very different cultural and linguistic backgrounds. And that question was quite central, in that I realized quite quickly that actually the training that I had had up until then was not very effusive or particularly acknowledging of diversity, which sort of really got me thinking again about really what prepares me now to do this work. What assumptions am I drawing on? What are my own cultural references that I'm drawing on that may or may not work in my current sort of cultural setting? I started to think about, you know, how do I know what I know, and how do I begin to actually situate myself in this new area of work. So this really was a catalyst that began this exploration around this topic. And it was interesting to me because in some ways there was not a lot for me to draw on or look at from within the literature or coaching practice. And I began to really see a lot of assumptions that were being made about coaching and coaching practice that I wasn't sure I could see in the work I was doing in Asia or across Asia. So this process led to some disorientation. This photo, I think, captures that at times I felt like it was really sort of difficult to see a way forward. It was quite disorienting. There was a lot of uncertainty that I was working with over this time and continue to work with. I mean, I'm not saying that it's all completely clear and certain now, but there was a certain part of that journey that felt like I was sort of out in the wilderness and trying to find my way. Also, the narrative also became one of sort of real wonder about diversity and the impact of diversity in human-centered practices. And it really became quite a source of wonder and continues to be a source of wonder for me as I continue to engage in my own practice. And I also started to think about in what ways was this experience generative, both for myself, but also potentially for coaching? And in what ways was it also developmental? So I found that in this experience, there was a lot of, if you like, light and shade in the experience. I was often reflecting and thinking about, what do I hold on to and what do I think I need to let go of in order to respond in the new sort of cultural context and in thinking about my own coaching practice. What assumptions was I holding that perhaps were beginning to have some, if you like, cracks in them? So this process, took place over quite a long period of time. It actually really continues to today. I continue to think about these sorts of questions, but still find the whole area quite a sense, I have quite a strong sense of wonder and awe about the opportunity that we have when we fully engage with diversity and the way in which it can help shape our practice in ways that perhaps we haven't previously thought about or expected. One of the things I noticed during this time was that there was not a lot written about diversity in coaching. Coaching was quite silent in many ways for a long time about the influence of diversity. We're beginning to see that change now. There are some voices that are coming to the fore around the need for us to really consider this aspect in the work that we are doing. So I'm delighted to see that. But back then, so when I first went to Asia, it was in 2002. So it was quite a long time ago that I began this journey. Okay, so for this, I think this will be an opportunity actually, Okon, for us to actually go into a breakout room. And some of you in the earlier sort of comments have mentioned about some of the things that are showing up in your own practice. But this is an opportunity just to talk together. We'll have groups of probably 2 or 3, but just for you to talk together about what are you noticing about context in your own coaching practice? How is it showing up? You know, we've had some mention of different working with people outside of your home country, which is bringing up context, but it can come up in many ways. You know, cultural context is only one context. There are many other contexts that we need to engage with that can be very diverse in the clients and organizations that we work with. So, Con, if we could put people into a breakout room for, I would say, let's say about 5 minutes, just for us to sort of touch base on what you're noticing in your own practice. Is that okay, Con?
Yes, it is, and I'm ready
Yes,
to I'm ready to go. And those are the questions you want considered.
Yes, yeah, well, yes, and I think, look, you can be quite take that in a very broad sense, because what's important, I think, is the conversations that we're having. So how you want to respond to those questions is completely up to you. But broadly, what are you noticing? How is it showing up in how is context showing up in your coaching practice? Okay, so I think we're all back now. So perhaps if we just get any comments just from you, don't need to share specific sort of comments made in your group, but what were some of the themes that were emerging in your discussions? If it was anything like the group I was in, we really just started to touch the surface, which I think is where we'll be at for most of this conversation. But any sort of themes or feedback that anyone would like to share from your conversations?
Was just, you know, coaching in different arenas, cultures, whether it be industries, just getting familiar with that sometimes is just what are the norms within the industries, what are the cultural differences to be aware of. One thing we talked about was, you know, within cultures, some cultures are more reluctant to speak up in a group setting where they might be wanting to be called on, etc. So those are the kinds of things. And please, the rest of the group, jump in if I missed anything.
Thank you for sharing that, Marcia. It sounds like an interesting conversation, and you know, some really key points about working with folk who are from different cultures and thinking about the way in which we do that. Thank you. Anyone else like to share? Sherry?
In my group, there seems to be several people that commented they were not sure what the word context meant that you were talking about, and probably would be good to have a little bit more clarification on what specifically that means to you or in the context of our meeting today.
Okay, I shall have a look at that. Thank you.
Okay.
Anyone else like to comment on anything that was important? Okay, well, let me just go back to sharing. Okay, oops. So context can really show in various ways, and it's really thinking about what is the sort of, if you like, the background that we are working with when we're in our coaching relationship. So for example, you know, there are many different types of if you like, contextual spaces that we might be working with. And to a certain extent, you know, when you think about a range of practices, and in society more generally, I think we are being called in a way to consider context more deeply, to acknowledge context and differences in context, to be thinking about the assumptions that we might be making. So, for example, this whole call towards acknowledging diversity, the diversity that exists between us, within us, diversity that may be visible, but also diversity that may not be visible. It may not be spoken, it may be not spoken or silent. But the idea of what we are including, what we might be excluding, and how are we creating a sense of belonging. Context also touches on areas like our sense of identity, gender, culture, organizational context, which is probably as coaches something that we are quite used to thinking about in terms of what's the context for the client. If we're doing organizational work, what's the context or culture of the organization, for example. But systems, time, like the time in which the coaching is taking place, can also be a contextual field, if you like, in the coaching. Historical events, what's occurring. And I mean, in our recent history, we have had the pandemic, and also we've had this quite a conversation in coaching also around climate change. So they could also be examples of a period in time where a particular context might be coming to the fore. So I hope that answers a little bit of the questions that you were raising, Sherry, about the different contextual spaces that may be present. The journey that sort of, I guess, began for me when I moved and relocated, in some ways was aspects of that were highly visible because I was in a completely different culture. But also, it's important for us to recognize that the context may be present that we are unaware of when we're working with clients in coaching spaces. It may not be spoken or it may not be visible. Okay. Sherry, yes.
Bev, I was going to mention, I'm looking at that list. I think, unless you've lived in a different culture, I have personally, but if you haven't, I think looking at that list, what comes to me that I often see and deal with in coaching is the issue of being in or out. Are you included or are you excluded? And that can take on many forms. One of the things I really like to do is sometimes attend high-level leaders team meetings, their leadership team, and just observe how they meet. Just watch it for an hour. You can pick up a lot. You can see who might be a favorite son or a daughter, among the team, and whose comments are not really well taken or listened to, and how that might make that person feel. I think there's a lot of that's going on, and I think in the course of everyday business, a lot of times that can be missed. And that's, I think, the value of a coach sometimes in those settings is to try to build the team up by either doing some, one-on-one coaching with team members and also with the leader, and trying to, strengthen some that need strengthening, or, point out to the leader how they can strengthen the team by listening to the voices more equally in the meetings that they have. So that's one thing I've noticed and I work with a lot.
Right, great example. You know, like that idea of, you know, listening to the voices. And I think it's a phrase I've heard myself using in terms of thinking, when we are really becoming attuned to context, what are the new
Yes.
voices that we might be listening to from others, but also within ourselves? And you know, the other piece I think is important for us just to kind of touch on or connect with is that the diversity is present within our communities in a variety of ways. We don't have to actually move out of them. So, for example, you know, I relocated and was immersed in a different culture or a range of cultures across my work when I worked across the Asian region. But actually in our communities, you know, within our own countries, there is a lot of diversity, including cultural diversity, that is present. So it's important for us to recognize that it's present within our spaces, as well as if we, you know, relocate, for example. And that was something that was quite an important part of my own journey to recognize. I think someone had their hand raised. I can't see who that was. So if you did have your hand raised and you want to speak, please unmute yourself.
Sorry, I had my hand raised. I guess I'm a little curious because a lot that's like coming up for me is this feeling of like ego around diversity and hypervigilance towards it, being kind of individualized, that you're with a group setting or an individual that you know that may be different from your context. So I'm just wondering if there is a level of ego to have when you are aware of something that may not be needed, and wondering like how do you kind of re-regulate yourself and kind of re-evaluate if the diversity that you're noticing is as important as the diversity that they are either already immersed in. Basically trying to say, how do you, not, I want to say not care, but like how do you normalize yourself in something that maybe no one's not even noticing themselves, if that makes sense at all?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think it is speaking to the idea of how we actually attune in coaching and look at what's important. So some of these aspects, as you say, may not be important to individuals, but how do we actually attune to what is important in the context so that we're not, like, how do we even enter that space so that we're not potentially overlooking something that may be important? Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, some great questions coming up. I think this is why it's really important to have these conversations together, because there are so many questions about how we manage when we are faced with working with diversity and the diversity that is present before us. So this is another opportunity to think about and to spend some time in a small group. We'll go into a breakout room for this as well, OkoCon. But just, you know, again, you know, you might just want to focus on one of these questions, or you can, you know, work with a question that you think works best for you. But I'm just wondering that as you are working as a coach and experiencing some of these different contexts coming into view, you know, is there anything that's being amplified? Is there anything that's being challenged? Is there any ways in which your coaching has changed? We've had some indication from some of you about some of this already. But just spend some time. I think, OkoCon, if we could have, I would say, probably another sort of 5 minutes. So it'd be quite a quick conversation, but just noting maybe one aspect of one of those questions that you might like to share in the small breakout group.
Okay, the groups are happening now. Yes, and then back over to you.
Okay, great. Anyone who would like to share any themes from your conversations? We certainly had an interesting conversation together in the group I was in. Any comments anyone would like to share?
Well, in my group, we talked about listening, and that being an aspect, like even the, where we ended up in our conversation was that there's the experience of entering into an engagement with an organization, and one of their priorities, and I believe it was a 360 assessment, or go ahead and correct me if I'm saying it wrong, but that was one of the things that they're looking for as a highlight, that listening and the ability to listen. Yeah, that was that was one of the things that, when we entered into the conversation in the room, was brought up, is that, people come from even the same area or same space, but there's such a diversity within that area. And so, like, even as I'm saying it now, one of the things that comes into awareness, being self-aware, right, is, we think about ideas of, what kind of biases or what kind of beliefs that we hold, what are we bringing, what kind of meaning are we creating, shared meaning are we creating for that through the work. But yeah, the listening and the intentionality around how we listen was really where our conversation orbited around.
Sounds like a really interesting conversation, Darius.
In our group, we shared some perspectives about the importance of understanding other perspectives, team building, and then recognizing that there is implicit bias, and the need to overcome that and recognize that everyone who has value, male, female, no matter what color, and to recognize those that have value, and move forward with those things in mind. It was very helpful for me.
Oh, fantastic. I'm glad to hear that, Ned. Thanks for sharing. Any other final comment before we move on and actually move towards close?
I think Sherry just had her hand.
Oh,
Okay.
Sherry, great.
Oh, I was just gonna say a little more about what Ned said. I think so often when we are trying to change a culture in an organization and bring in more diversity, we have to be cognizant that some people will feel like we're stepping on their toes and feeling disaffected by that. And that the best way I found to really overcome that, as Ned mentioned, is to really acknowledge organizationally everybody's good efforts, no matter of what color, race, gender, whatever, but also create what I call breaking bread opportunities. When we as people are allowed in team building meetings or company picnics or baseball game or something to work together and get to know each other better, that's sometimes when we really get to know the true humanity in one another and just don't stop at appearances. So I really highly recommend the breaking bread opportunities that come up.
Thanks for sharing that, Sherry. And it sounds like one of the themes that's been quite strong is really this sort of becoming aware of ourselves and aware of ourselves in interaction with either, you know, a client, a coachee, or a team or an organization. Like that seems to be something that's particularly important that has arisen. Let me just return to screen share as we sort of head back into the closing piece. I really appreciate the sharing and comments that have come through. So in closing, you know, we've actually really asked ourselves a number of questions, and this is something that I think is really important for us as coaches and practitioners and emerging practitioners, is that we really ask ourselves a lot of questions in this area. I'm a really strong advocate for also coaching as a field to really explore its own relationship with diversity, inclusion, and belonging. For research that is broader and acknowledges diversity more, that we, as a global profession, we tap into the diversity that's present within our professional spaces and actually look at what the opportunity is for learning for all of us, the way in which, if we tap into that diversity, the way in which it will add and improve all coaching. I believe that there is a tremendous generative value, and that we really need to focus on advocating for research and practice that actually specifically looks at diversity. And in closing, just to acknowledge that we are also bringing context about ourselves, and for us to recognize and to think about what's important in my own context as a coach, and how might that be showing up in the work that I'm doing. So I want to thank you all for joining in this conversation. There's a lot of questions and, you know, not clear-cut answers, but I think that this is a journey that we are on together in coaching, and I've appreciated the way in which we've had an opportunity to engage today. So back to you, Okokon. I will stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Bev, for what you have provoked and instigated in this space. And I love your concluding words, which is an invitation for us to pay attention to the context that we embody and bring into the experiences that we have. So let's kind of join our hands in thanking Bev for this stimulating 1 hour of conversation. Yeah. I did put the survey link in the chat. Please complete that by the latest next week, Wednesday, so we can get it going and get your CEU certificates to you. And there was a list of the next 3 coaching in context webinars. We hope to see you at any one of those or all of those in the near future. Thanks for coming, and have a great rest of your day. Yeah, bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.